On the 20th of October 1496, in the small town of Leer, near the city of Antwerp in the Low Countries, one of the most significant events in European history took place. That day, a 16-year-old princess of the Spanish royal house of Trastamara, Joanna of Castile, married Philip the Handsome, Duke of Burgundy, Lord of the Netherlands, and a member of the Austrian House of Habsburg. Philip's father was Maximilian of the House of Habsburg, Archduke of Austria, and later, the Holy Roman Emperor. The marriage might not have seemed too unusual to anyone who witnessed it. Philip was only about a year and a half older than his bride, and it seemed like a normal dynastic marriage to cement ties between two different royal families. But in this marriage were sown the seeds of the expansion of the House of Habsburg to become the most powerful family anywhere in the world. Though Joanna had several brothers and sisters, they were all either illegitimate, younger than her, or died prematurely. This meant that she inherited the thrones of Castile and Aragon years later and united Spain under her rule. Her eldest son with Philip, Charles, would therefore become the first Habsburg ruler of Spain. This, combined with Spain's colonial activity at the time, meant that by the middle of the 16th century, the House of Habsburg ruled over large parts of Western and Central Europe, including Spain, Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, the Low Countries, and parts of Italy, as well as a growing empire around the world on which the sun rarely set. It was a long way to have come for a family which started out in medieval times as minor aristocrats near the Swiss Alps. Habsburg rule over large parts of Europe would continue unabated until the end of the First World War in 1918. This is the remarkable story of the House of Habsburg and how they came to rule large parts of the world. It all started very humbly. Strangely, it didn't start either in Austria or Spain or the Low Countries. Instead, the story of the Habsburgs broadly began in the north of what we now call Switzerland in the early 11th century, though in those days there weren't even the beginnings of a Swiss confederacy, and this was considered a part of wider Germania. Around 1025, a West German lord by the name of Radbot, Count of Klettgau, decided to build a new castle in what is now the canton of Aargau in the north of Switzerland. He named it Habsburg Castle. There are two possible meanings for this. The Burg part of the name is a generic German term for a settlement or fortified site. Hence we find many large German cities called Hamburg, Nuremberg, and so forth. The Habs might refer to either a hawk or a ford. If it refers to a ford, the name effectively means the settlement by the ford of the river. Or if it references a hawk, it was alluding to the altitude at which the castle was built. At the time Radbot built the castle, surnames were not common in most of Europe. People began adopting surnames in the 12th and 13th centuries. Some of these were patronymic surnames, which indicated a line of descent. Others were occupational, such as Smith, indicating one was a blacksmith, while others still indicated where a person or family hailed from. Radbot's ancestors, who continued to live at Habsburg Castle, adopted the name of their family seat or ancestral home as their surname. Hence was born the House of Habsburg. The early history of the House of Habsburg set the tone for how they advanced as a great royal house for centuries to come. They grew more powerful through marriage alliances. Through these, the heads of the house, who were officially styling themselves as Count von Habsburg or Count of Habsburg by the middle of the 12th century, acquired additional lands in western Germany and around the Alps. An important pivot occurred in the 13th century, as they began focusing on extending their dominions into what we now call Austria, although this was considered a southern extension of Germania at the time. The key figure in this process was Rudolf von Habsburg. In 1250, the office of Holy Roman Emperor, which was a kind of loose elective overseer of the Holy Roman Empire, a conglomeration of hundreds of independent principalities across Germany and surrounding lands, had fallen into abeyance. The German princes could not decide on a new emperor, and there would be no further emperors until the 14th century. However, several individuals were elected to the lesser title of King of Germany. Rudolf von Habsburg acquired this title in 1273. He then exploited it to acquire extensive new territories for his family in Austria, making two of his sons Dukes of Austria and Styria in 1282. With this, a family of West German origin that owed their name to a Swiss castle became the preeminent lords of Austria and moved their power base to Vienna. This was little more than a town at the time, though under Habsburg patronage it grew. The University of Vienna, for instance, was founded in 1365 by Rudolf IV, Duke of Austria. The family continued to grow in power over the next 2 centuries, and in 1452, Frederick III was elected as the first member of the House of Habsburg with the full title of Holy Roman Emperor. With the exception of one minor gap of a few years in the 1740s, the Habsburgs monopolized the position of emperor until the Holy Roman Empire was brought to an end 3.5 centuries later, in 1806. The family's power continued to grow rapidly in the late 15th century. As the first Habsburg Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick III elevated the family status within Austria from the title of dukes to archdukes. More importantly, he married his son Maximilian to Mary of Burgundy in 1477. The Duchy of Burgundy is a forgotten great power. In the late 14th and early 15th centuries, its rulers expanded out of their power base in the Burgundy region of eastern France to conquer the entirety of the 17 provinces of the Low Countries, comprising modern-day Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and parts of northeastern France around Artois. This was an extremely wealthy part of Europe, and historians today speak of a Burgundian Renaissance, which rivaled the Italian Renaissance south of the Alps in the 15th century. However, the Burgundian line of succession was tenuous, as Duke Charles the Bold did not have a legitimate male heir, and the Salic law, which forbade female succession, was in force in the Burgundian lands. Thus, when Charles was killed at the Battle of Nancy in 1477, the vast majority of the Burgundian lands passed to the House of Habsburg via Maximilian's marriage to Charles's daughter Mary. In this way, the Habsburgs came to rule over the 17 provinces of the Low Countries. Although by this time the burgeoning Swiss Confederacy had pushed them out of their alpine lands, the Habsburgs had emerged by the late 15th century as one of Europe's great houses, archdukes of Austria, lords of the Low Countries, and Holy Roman emperors. This was the context in which the Spanish monarchs, Queen Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon, whose marriage in 1469 would act to later unify Spain into one kingdom, decided to marry their daughter Joanna to Maximilian's son Philip in 1496. As we have seen, this served to bring the Habsburgs to power in Spain as well. Isabella and Ferdinand had a son, John, but his death in 1497, a year after Joanna had married Philip, upended the succession in Spain. Joanna now became the heir apparent in a country which did allow female monarchical rule. However, Joanna was deemed to have descended into madness after her husband died in 1506. There was a vicious familial power struggle underway here. The terms of Ferdinand II's marriage to Isabella back in 1469 had stipulated that he could not succeed as King of Castile, even if his wife predeceased him. With Isabella dead since 1504, Ferdinand now appears to have had his allegedly mad daughter cloistered and took his grandson, the future King Charles V, son of Joanna and Philip, who was only born in 1500, and used him as a figurehead to rule both Castile and Aragon himself, down to his death in 1516. At that point, after a further power struggle with his mother, 16-year-old Charles was proclaimed as King of Spain. He would also rule the Low Countries, Spain's lands in Italy, such as the islands of Sicily and Sardinia, while in 1519 he was elected as Holy Roman Emperor. There was already a separation between the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs underway at this point. While Charles briefly succeeded as Archduke of Austria in 1519, following the death of his grandfather Maximilian, he relinquished the Austrian lands to his brother, Ferdinand I, 2 years later, in awareness that a single Habsburg ruler could not effectively rule Austria, the Low Countries, Spain, and parts of Italy. Charles V's reign down to 1556 was, in many ways, the pinnacle of Habsburg power. He was the most powerful ruler in Europe at the time. He continued a series of wars which had begun between the Spanish and the French for dominance of Italy in 1494 and held huge influence over the papacy. In 1527, his mutinous forces attacked and captured the city of Rome. This effectively made Pope Clement VII a prisoner of the Habsburgs. This was an important development, as it ensured that the Pope could not grant King Henry VIII of England his desire to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who was Charles's aunt. Therefore, it was the dynastic politics of the Habsburgs and their rise to such immense influence over Europe in the early 16th century that drove Henry VIII to split with Rome and initiate the English Protestant Reformation in the 1530s. Meanwhile, through a crisis for the Christian cause of another kind, the Habsburgs acquired several more thrones and titles in 1526. The Turkish Ottoman Empire had been expanding rapidly in the Balkans since the late 14th century. They conquered Constantinople in 1453 and then continued to press northwards. On the 29th of August 1526, they clashed with the armies of King Louis II of Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs in Hungary. Louis was killed in the clash. He was the last direct head of the royal Jagiellon dynasty in Hungary. With his death, his lands passed to Ferdinand of Habsburg, Charles's brother, who, in addition to being Archduke of Austria, now became King of Hungary, Bohemia, and Croatia. Thus, by 1526, the Habsburgs ruled, at least nominally, over Austria, Hungary, Croatia, Bohemia, Spain, the Low Countries, and much of Italy, while also having monopolized the post of Holy Roman Emperor in Germany. It was an incredible ascent for a family who had started off as humble local lords in the Swiss Alps. It wasn't just in Europe that Charles, as head of the House of Habsburg, presided over vast dominions. Charles V was also, in a way, the first ruler of a truly global superpower. There had been immense empires before. That of the Mongols had stretched temporarily from Ukraine in Europe all the way across Asia to the Korean peninsula in the 13th century, while earlier powers like the Persian and Roman empires had dominated much of the world as they knew it. Spain eclipsed all of these, acquiring territories in virtually every part of the world. When Charles came to the throne, Spanish colonists had already established settlements in Cuba, Hispaniola, and other parts of the Caribbean. In the first years of Charles's reign, Hernán Cortés and a few hundred Spanish conquistadors managed to conquer the powerful Aztec Empire in Mexico. In the 1530s, the Pizarro brothers initiated a war against the Inca Empire in South America. An expedition initially led by Ferdinand Magellan completed the first circumnavigation of the world for the Spanish between 1519 and 1522. In 1543, Ruy López de Villalobos discovered a chain of islands in Southeast Asia and claimed them for Spain, naming them after Charles's son and heir, Philip. Finally, Spain also had a few coastal enclaves in Africa, meaning that by the middle of the 16th century, it laid claim to much of the Caribbean, Central America, South America, parts of coastal Africa, and the Philippines in Asia. Immense wealth followed. In Mexico, Peru, and Bolivia, the Spanish found large silver and gold deposits, most notably a veritable mountain of silver at Potosi in Bolivia. Soon, treasure fleets were being sent back annually from the Americas to Spain, carrying the modern equivalent of billions of dollars in silver and gold. So vast was the amount of money which the Habsburgs acquired from their global empire that inflation spiked worldwide by somewhere between 300% and 600% between the conquest of the Aztec Empire in the early 1520s and the middle of the 17th century. Ultimately, power and wealth was not enough to make Charles a happy man. A devout Roman Catholic, he was deeply disturbed by the Protestant Reformation that began in 1517, 2 years before he became Holy Roman Emperor. He spent much of his life trying to stop the spread of Martin Luther's heresy, as he viewed it, around Europe. It only got worse, with more radical Protestant groups like the Calvinists and Anabaptists emerging in the 1530s. Charles would wage wars around the continent, trying to stop this from happening, to little avail. In the process, he established the Habsburgs as the royal family of Europe that were most closely associated with the defense of Roman Catholicism. Eventually, worn out from the cause, he took the unusual step of giving up his royal and imperial titles in 1556, handing over power to his son, King Philip II. Philip would rule for 42 years down to 1598. When he ascended to the throne of Spain, he had already been King of England and Ireland, pursuant from his marriage to his cousin, Queen Mary Tudor, in 1554. She died in 1558, but for a brief time, a Habsburg even ruled England, Wales, and Ireland. Philip, though, would never be Holy Roman Emperor. When his father gave up his positions in 1556, the division of the Habsburg dominions was cemented. Philip succeeded as King of Spain, and to the lands in Italy and the Low Countries, as well as Spain's colonial empire. But Charles's brother, Ferdinand, claimed the title of Holy Roman Emperor. The Spanish branch of the family would never hold that title again. Hence, from the late 1550s, there were the Spanish Habsburgs who ruled Spain and its empire and were descended from Charles and Philip, and the Austrian Habsburgs who dominated Central Europe and were descended from Ferdinand. Philip II was very much his father's son. In fact, he went even further in his determination to crush the Protestant heresy that he believed was infecting Europe. His long reign was characterized by an endless succession of wars as a result. When he succeeded his father, the Italian wars were still underway. He brought these to a conclusion in 1559, with Spain ending the 65-year-long conflict as the dominant power in Italy. Philip also continued the wars against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean Sea. For instance, it was the Spanish, in alliance with the Venetians and several smaller powers, who launched an armada of over 200 galleys that fought the Turks at the Battle of Lepanto in the Ionian Sea on the 7th of October 1571. It was one of the largest naval battles in history. By then, Philip was already fighting a revolt against the Dutch Protestants of the Low Countries, the start of what would become the 80 Years' War. Relations with England were deteriorating as Mary's successor, Queen Elizabeth, restored Protestantism as the state religion there after she became queen in 1558. A long Cold War between the English and the Spanish would erupt into the First Anglo-Spanish War, beginning in 1585, the most famous confrontation of which was the Spanish Armada of 1588. In France, Philip channeled aid to the Catholic faction in the Wars of Religion, which tore the country apart between 1562 and 1598. By the late 1580s, Spanish troops were fighting directly on French soil. All of this effort to fight Muslims and Protestants required Spain to maintain tens of thousands of soldiers all the time, often surpassing 100,000 men, an enormous number for the early modern era. It cost a fortune, and despite the unimaginable wealth arriving from the silver mines of the New World, the Spanish government failed to pay its bills and essentially declared bankruptcy on 4 occasions during Philip's reign, in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. In the end, all the money that Philip spent was for nothing. England, though a very small power by comparison with the might of the Habsburgs, fought the Spanish to a stalemate by 1604. The war with the Dutch continued intermittently until 1648, yet as early as the 1590s, there was no doubt that the Dutch Republic would survive and was actually entering a golden age of prosperity. The Habsburgs, however, did manage to maintain control over the southern provinces of the Low Countries around what we would now call Belgium. In France, the country remained broadly Catholic, although the king from 1589, Henry IV, was effectively a Protestant who agreed to convert to Catholicism to end the wars of religion, hardly the result which Philip had envisaged when he intervened there. Meanwhile, as the bankruptcies of his reign demonstrated, the flow of silver from the Americas had its limitations. Furthermore, in the reigns of his successors, Philip III and Philip IV, the amount of silver that was arriving each year in the treasure fleet started to decline dramatically. By the middle of the 17th century, it was a fraction of what it had been in the heyday of Philip II. As this occurred, Spain was revealed for what it was, a country with a backwards economy and a political system where money was spent frivolously by the monarch and courtiers. Revolts in the 1640s led to the loss of Portugal, which reasserted its independence. A cohort of writers began preparing treatises addressing the question of how to stop the decline of the country and its empire, but they had little impact. By the time England and Spain ended up at war between 1654 and 1660, England was the ascendant power, and Spain, under the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs, was in perilous decline. Things were also difficult for the other branch of the dynasty in Vienna. The Austrian Habsburgs were nowhere near as powerful as the Spanish side of the family in the second half of the 16th century. They faced a number of difficulties. Although the family had a virtual monopoly on the office of Holy Roman Emperor during these centuries, successive heads of the family in Vienna were unable to roll back the spread of Protestantism in Germany, and it also had a hold over their lands in the Kingdom of Bohemia. Moreover, the Turks continued to press on their southern border, conquering lands in the Balkans over time. The issue of religious divisions within the lands of the Austrian Habsburgs and the wider Holy Roman Empire boiled over in 1618, into the most destructive war in the history of early modern Europe. The conflict was partly brought about by the rise of Ferdinand of Inner Austria, a member of the family who would become Holy Roman Emperor as Ferdinand II in 1619. He was already flexing his muscles as the ascendant power within the family by the mid-1610s. His efforts to enforce Catholicism in Bohemia led to a revolt against Habsburg rule there in 1618, which then ballooned into a wider war against the Habsburgs throughout Central Europe. In the early stages of this, the Habsburgs met with a fair degree of success and had broken the resistance of several Lutheran and Calvinist states like the Palatine Elector of the Rhine and the Protestant lords of Bohemia. However, every time the Habsburgs seemed to be about to win the war, a foreign power would intervene on the side of the German Protestants to rebalance the situation. Denmark intervened first in 1625. Sweden became involved in 1629 and conquered much of Central Europe before being pushed back by the Habsburgs and their allies in the 1630s. Finally, France had to intervene on behalf of the German Protestants in 1635. The war dragged on until 1648 and ended in a stalemate wherein each state agreed to respect the religious stance of every other state. The 30 Years' War could be said to have been a failure for the Austrian Habsburgs. Their goal was to enforce conformity to Catholicism within their own dominions and break the independence of some of the larger Protestant powers of Germany. They failed in this goal, and even within Bohemia and Hungary, large Protestant communities survived. Historians have argued that beyond the religious issue, what the Austrian Habsburgs were trying to do between 1618 and 1648 was to turn their control over the Holy Roman Empire, a loose and largely ceremonial conglomerate of scores of independent states, into a centralized monarchy controlled by them. Had they done so, the Habsburgs might have united Germany under their sole rule. Yet, they were thwarted time and time again, first by the Danes, then by the Swedes, and finally by the French. There is a major what if here. If these other European powers had not intervened, it is plausible that the Habsburgs could have become entirely dominant in Central Europe. The history of the continent might have been very different if this had occurred. It wasn't to be. Regrettably, the failed effort left death and destruction in its wake. By the time the Habsburgs agreed to peace terms through the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, millions of people had died during the war, primarily from mass atrocities, famine, and disease. The fortunes of the House of Habsburg during this era were dictated to a great extent by the leaders of the family and how effective they were as rulers. This applies to both the Spanish and Austrian sides of the dynasty. Charles V and Philip II are two of the most notable figures in the history of early modern Europe. But were they good rulers? It's hard to conclude that they were. They inherited vast domains as a result of fortuitous dynastic politics and marriage arrangements. In addition, a cohort of fairly ruthless conquistadors operating across the Atlantic Ocean developed a Spanish empire for them without any major oversight from Madrid. All Charles and Philip did was bankrupt an incredibly wealthy state through endless wars, whereby they unsuccessfully sought to crush Protestantism across Europe. Rudolf II, who ruled the Austrian lands and served as Holy Roman Emperor between 1576 and his death in 1612, was a cultured man who sponsored a lot of interesting and eclectic painters and scholars at his court in Vienna. But he was not an effective ruler. Ferdinand II's zealous Catholicism ensured that Europe was plunged into the 30 Years' War, a vicious war from which the Habsburgs gained little and lost much. Leopold I, who ruled the Austrian lands from 1657 and did so down to 1705, was arguably a capable ruler, though he too was excessively eager to impose Catholicism in Central Europe and made mistakes because of this. In all of this, it is worth noting that there was no Habsburg ruler, either in Austria or Spain, who was given the epithet the Great, in the same way that Frederick II of Prussia is known as Frederick the Great, or in the way that Peter I and Catherine II of Russia both became known as the Great, on account of the way they transformed their states and made them more powerful. The perception was that the Habsburgs had flourished because of fortuitous marriage alliances, yet all of their rulers were flawed, to varying degrees. Leopold I did have a major success in the Balkans, turning a crisis there into an opportunity. After the Battle of Mohacs, all the way back in 1526, which had seen King Louis II of Hungary killed and the titles of King of Hungary, Bohemia and Croatia falling to the Austrian Habsburgs, the Ottomans had continued to consolidate their control over the Balkans. Their aggressive expansion here slowed down for a while as they looked southwards and eastwards, conquering Egypt, most of the Maghreb, and large parts of the Middle East in the 16th century. In the middle of the 17th century, their attention returned to the Balkans, and in 1683, Sultan Mehmed IV dispatched an army of roughly 150,000 men under Kara Mustafa Pasha to try to conquer Vienna. At the time, the Austrians and Spanish Habsburgs had been mired in a succession of wars against Louis XIV of France, and most of Austria's military resources were further westwards, in the Low Countries and other locations. Consequently, when the vast Turkish army showed up at Vienna in the summer of 1683, it seemed that the capital of the Austrian Habsburgs really could fall, and the Ottomans might begin to expand into Central Europe. In the end, it was only owing to the intervention of King John III Sobieski of Poland with a large relief force that the siege of Vienna was relieved. Thereafter, a grand coalition of the Habsburgs, the Poles, the Russians, and the Republic of Venice launched the Great Turkish War. When it ended after 15 years of fighting in 1699, Leopold I of Austria acquired extensive territory in Hungary, Transylvania, and other parts of the Balkans. While the Austrian side of the family were dealing with the threat posed by the Turks in the second half of the 17th century, the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs were also mired in a crisis, though of a very different kind. The Habsburgs had not simply come to rule Austria and Spain as a result of the marriage of Joanna of Castile to Philip of Burgundy all the way back in 1496. The two branches of the family had continued intermarrying for over 150 years after this. This was inbreeding of a severe kind. For instance, King Philip III of Spain married his first cousin, Margaret of Austria, in 1599. A daughter from their marriage, Maria Anna, married her first cousin, Emperor Ferdinand III of the Austrian side of the family, her own mother's nephew. Then, to make matters worse, Maria Anna's daughter, Mariana of Austria, married King Philip IV of Spain in 1649. Philip was Mariana's mother's brother. Thus, generations of first cousins marrying each other from the Spanish and Austrian branches of the house culminated in Mariana marrying her uncle. Philip and she had several children. A single son lived into his adult years as the sole heir to the Spanish throne. The problem was that the young man, Charles or Carlos, was very ill from birth. The exact cause of his illness has never been fully resolved. It seems to have been a combination of several maladies, plausibly caused by severe inbreeding over numerous generations. His cognitive development was seemingly limited. His jaw did not meet properly with the rest of his skull, and he appears to have suffered from hydrocephalus, a condition where excess cerebrospinal fluid builds up in the skull. Charles became King of Spain in 1665, when he was just 3 years old. It was expected he would die young, though he ultimately lived down to 1700, when he passed away at 38 years of age. Despite his poor health, he had married twice, but neither marriage resulted in children, and there was now no heir to the throne in Spain. His death consequently plunged Europe in 1701 into the War of the Spanish Succession. The key issue at the heart of the War of the Spanish Succession was whether a member of the Austrian Habsburgs should succeed to the Spanish throne, being very closely related cousins of the Spanish Habsburgs, or if a member of the French royal House of Bourbon should succeed the deceased Charles. The French had a claim to the throne by right of King Louis XIV of France, having married Maria Theresa of Spain, Charles's half-sister, back in 1660. Therefore, many of the French royals were Habsburgs by the turn of the century on their mother's side. Most of Europe's great powers had assumed that the Spanish throne would pass to a member of the Austrian Habsburgs on Charles's death, but the ill king, shortly before his death, had indicated that he wished for Philip, Duke of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV and his half-sister, to succeed him as King of Spain. The dispute escalated into a pan-European war within months. Britain, the Dutch Republic, Portugal and Prussia all allied with Austria, while France had the assistance of the Spanish, who wanted to assent to Charles's last wish, as well as Bavaria and several other smaller powers. The war dragged on for 12 years before a compromise was reached through the Peace of Utrecht. Philip of Anjou was accepted as King Philip V of Spain, on the proviso that the Spanish and French thrones could never be united under a sole ruler. The Austrian Habsburgs were compensated for relinquishing their claim by being given most of Spain's European territories outside of Spain itself. Thus, the Spanish Netherlands around modern-day Belgium became the Austrian Netherlands, while the Austrian Habsburgs also acquired possession of the Duchy of Milan, Naples, and Sardinia. The situation for the Austrian Habsburgs during the 18th century was complex. In theory, they had exited the war more dominant in Central Europe than they had ever been. They were, for instance, now the major power of the Italian peninsula and had acquired a berth on the Atlantic Ocean via the Austrian Netherlands. In 1722, Emperor Charles VI oversaw the creation of the Ostend Company near Bruges as a trading and colonial endeavour to try and establish an Austrian Habsburg colonial presence overseas, although it failed. Despite the strong position they found themselves in, the Austrian Habsburgs actually faced a growing threat. The Margravate of Brandenburg and the Duchy of Prussia had united in 1618 to become a substantial North German power, controlling extensive lands from Berlin east into what are now Poland and the Kaliningrad Oblast. In 1701, Duke Frederick III of Prussia declared himself the first king of the new Kingdom of Prussia. In 1740, the War of the Austrian Succession broke out over the issue of whether or not Maria Theresa of Austria would succeed as a female ruler of the Austrian Habsburg kingdoms and territories and as Holy Roman Empress. Prussia was central to the alliance that fought against the Austrians over the next 8 years. It was the start of a series of wars across the 18th century between Austria and Prussia that centered on control of the Silesia region. This was a resource-rich province that straddles the modern-day borders of Poland, Germany, and Czechia. Prussia acquired control of it and rose to become a serious threat to the Austrian Habsburgs in Central Europe under its long-ruling monarch, King Frederick II, between 1740 and 1786. Rivalry between Austria and Prussia would shape the outlook of the Habsburgs in Vienna for much of the 18th and 19th centuries. While the Austrian Habsburgs were generally rivals of the Prussian royal house of Hohenzollern, they were very capable of putting their differences aside when it came to both royal houses benefiting themselves. And there was much to be gained by acting in unison in the second half of the 18th century. Ever since the Union of Lublin in 1569, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been an absolutely vast state in Eastern Europe, one which covered most of modern-day Poland, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, and western Ukraine. It had once been a formidable power in this part of the continent. However, the rise of the Russian Empire had weakened it, and by the middle of the 18th century, the Commonwealth was the sick man of Europe. Accordingly, beginning in 1772 and concluding in 1795, the Austrians, Prussians, and Russians decided to carve up the territory of the Commonwealth between them. The Austrian Habsburgs added a huge chunk of territory to their growing dominions as a result. They acquired western Ukraine and southern Poland, including the cities of Lviv, Krakow, and Lublin. These gains were in addition to a further southward expansion of their dominions. The Austrians went to war on 3 different occasions with the Ottoman Empire in the 18th century, between 1716 and 1718, again from 1737 to 1739, and finally from 1788 to 1791. There was a certain amount of over and back during these clashes, but the Austrians generally made gains in Serbia and Bosnia, setting the scene for the collapse of Ottoman rule in the Balkans in the 19th century and the rise of various types of Slavic nationalism there too. The second and third partitions of Poland took place as Europe was descending into a period of war and crisis that it would not emerge from for a quarter of a century. The French Revolution had started in 1789 when King Louis XVI of France convened the Estates General, the French Parliament, for the first time in 175 years. The king was quickly sidelined, and the revolutionaries began establishing a constitutional monarchy in which Parliament would hold power. Gradually, the revolution became more and more radical in the early 1790s, until the king was deposed altogether and a republic was set up in September 1792. The following year, the revolutionaries placed both the king and Queen Marie Antoinette on trial and executed both of them. This caused great dismay in Vienna. Marie Antoinette was a member of the House of Habsburg. Accordingly, it was Austria and its ruling family that first led Europe to war against France in 1792 to try and rescue Marie Antoinette, who was still alive when the French Revolutionary Wars began. The Habsburgs would not fare well over the next 20 years. The French conquered the Austrian Netherlands and most of their territories in Italy in the mid-1790s, and then Napoleon Bonaparte inflicted a series of defeats on them in the 1800s, twice occupying Vienna in 1805 and 1809. The Habsburgs, though, managed to temper Napoleon's worst impulses. While he tore the Kingdom of Prussia apart and stripped it of about half of its lands in 1807, the Habsburgs formed a marriage alliance with the Emperor of the French by marrying Marie-Louise, an 18-year-old member of the family, to Bonaparte in 1810. It was a marriage of convenience. When Napoleon's invasion of Russia ended in disaster in 1812, the Habsburgs briefly considered honoring their alliance with the French before ultimately joining a new coalition that conquered Napoleon's European empire in 1813 and 1814. The Habsburgs exited the Napoleonic Wars with their dominions broadly intact. This was partly because Clemens von Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister, established himself as the leading European statesman of the age, and the peace negotiations at the end of the Napoleonic Wars were presided over by the Habsburgs in Vienna in 1814 and 1815. The Congress of Vienna set the basis for European diplomatic relations for the next 3 decades and reaffirmed the position of the Austrian Habsburgs as one of the great European dynastic houses. That being said, the Habsburgs did relinquish control over their territories in the Low Countries. From 1815 until the establishment of an independent Belgium in 1830, this region was ruled by the Kingdom of the Netherlands, ending 3.5 centuries of Habsburg involvement in the Low Countries. The Belgian Revolution of 1830 ushered in the creation of an independent state in the southern provinces of the Low Countries after hundreds of years of foreign domination. Elsewhere, the Austrians were in the ascendancy. The Ottomans were now well and truly in decline, and the Habsburgs hoped to gain greater influence in the Balkans as they did, although Russia was a rival in the region. In Italy, the Republic of Venice had never been reconstituted after the Napoleonic Wars, meaning the Austrians now ruled over Venice, Lombardy, including Milan, and the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. All of this brought problems. Back in 1804, in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars and in anticipation of the dismantling of the Holy Roman Empire, Archduke Francis II had declared the creation of a new Austrian Empire with himself as its first emperor. The empire he and his successors ruled over was ungainly. German-speaking peoples such as the Habsburgs themselves were in the minority and made up slightly less than 1/4 of the population. Ethnic Hungarians made up about 20%. The Czechs in Bohemia constituted around 1/8 of the population of the empire, while other Slavic groups like the Serbs and Croats made up another 10%, as did the Poles. Then there were sizable further minorities like the Romanians, Slovaks and Italians. Huge numbers of these continued to speak their own languages, and the rise of romantic nationalism in the post-Napoleonic era saw independence movements emerge in cities like Prague, Lviv and Krakow. It was a tough situation for the Habsburgs to manage, and when a series of revolts broke out across Europe in 1848, the so-called Springtime of the People, it led to major unrest across the Austrian Empire. Efforts by the Kingdom of Sardinia to wrest control of northern Italy from the Habsburgs failed, but in Hungary, the country was virtually taken over by the revolutionaries. It was only with Russian aid that the Habsburgs were able to reinforce control there in 1849, and even then they had to place Hungary under military occupation for the next 18 years to ensure fresh unrest would not commence. The rebellions of 1848 were only a precursor to a series of huge setbacks for the Habsburgs 20 years later. A lot of this was caused by the continuing rise of Prussia as a rival to Austria in Central Europe. The Revolution of 1848 in Germany had made it clear that there was strong support for German unification. Many perceived that Prussia should lead this process, although there were divisions, much of it based on religion. Prussia was a Protestant North German power, while Austria was a Catholic South German power. The smaller German states, of which there were approximately 36 in the 19th century after a process of consolidation during the Napoleonic Wars, tended to lean towards Austria or Prussia, depending on their own religious stance. Catholic Bavaria, for instance, viewed Austrian-led unification favorably. What the Austrian ruler, Emperor Franz Joseph, who had ascended in 1848, and who would become the longest-serving ruler of the House of Habsburg by living down to 1916, had not allowed for was the rise to high office of the Prussian aristocrat Otto von Bismarck in 1862. Over the next 9 years, Bismarck outflanked Austria entirely. He waged war on Denmark in 1864, then Austria in 1866, and finally France between 1870 and 1871. Through these short victorious conflicts, he united the smaller German states behind Prussia and formed the German Empire in 1871. With a few strokes, the Austrian Habsburgs had been relegated to second place amongst the royal houses of Central Europe, behind the Hohenzollerns of Prussia that now became the German emperors. What was more, in the Second and Third Wars of Italian independence in 1859 and 1866, the Kingdom of Sardinia prized away most of Austria's territories in Italy and unified the peninsula into the Kingdom of Italy. A bizarre project to install Maximilian of Habsburg, Franz Josef's brother, as a French-backed Emperor of Mexico backfired and resulted in him being overthrown and executed in 1867. Faced with such a catalogue of setbacks, Franz Josef agreed in 1867 to end the military occupation of Hungary that had been in force since the suppression of the 1848 Hungarian Revolution against Austrian rule, and to make the Hungarians partners in government. Thus, the Austrian Empire became the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1867. The Habsburgs continued to rule over Hungary, but the empire would now be governed as a dual monarchy, with a separate government in Hungary. 6 years later, the towns of Buda and Pest, on either side of the Danube River, united to form a new Hungarian capital, Budapest. This was an era of social change in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in many other ways. The Habsburg dominions in Central Europe, as with those in Spain, prior to the end of Habsburg rule there in 1700, had been very backwards from a socio-economic perspective. It was not until 1781 that Joseph II, a relatively enlightened Habsburg ruler, moved to end serfdom in his family's dominions, and that process was not fully completed until the middle of the 19th century, making the Habsburg domains amongst the last in Europe to abandon this retrograde form of medieval landholding and usage. There had also been very little industrialization here prior to the middle of the 19th century, 70 or so years after the Industrial Revolution began in England. That changed rapidly between the 1870s and 1900s as industrialization efforts accelerated in Austria-Hungary. The railway system was expanded, and the country became an early major center of the automotive industry, with companies like Daimler being set up here. Ferdinand Porsche, though usually associated with Germany, learned his trade in Austria, and in the 1900s was building some of the most innovative cars and trucks in the world. Vienna also became a major cultural center. In many ways, it always had been. The Habsburg court was, for instance, the epicenter of the world of classical music in the 18th and 19th centuries, to which Mozart and Beethoven gravitated. The most notable element of Vienna's culture at the turn of the 20th century was that the modern discipline of psychoanalysis was developed here by Sigmund Freud and his followers. While the Austro-Hungarian economy was being radically overhauled and developed in the last quarter of the 19th century, the diplomatic position of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was also changing. The unification of Germany under Prussian leadership and the loss of their extensive Italian possessions had forced the Habsburgs to re-evaluate their strategic goals in the 1870s. Emperor Franz Josef had believed prior to this that Austria could come to dominate Central Europe. That idea was in ruins as a result of events in Italy and Germany from 1859 to 1871. He and his ministers responded by focusing their attentions southwards. The Ottoman Empire was so weak by the 1870s that there were talks of it being carved up between the great powers like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had been between 1772 and 1795. The Habsburg ruler believed he could benefit from this. Russia was clearly a rival, and in a war between 1877 and 1878 had won a devastating victory over the Ottomans. It was this which led Austria-Hungary to enter into a surprising alliance with the newly formed German Empire. The dual alliance was agreed to in 1879 and was generally designed to provide mutual aid to each other against Russian expansion. In it lay the seeds of the destruction of Habsburg rule. The dual alliance was the first step in the development of two major military alliances in Europe. The Italians joined the Germans and Austrians in 1882. Russia drew closer to France with the dual entente of 1894. Finally, Britain allied with France through the Entente Cordiale in 1904. This meant that when Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the Habsburg heir to Emperor Franz Joseph, was assassinated in the streets of Sarajevo by a Serb nationalist on the 28th of June 1914, Europe was already divided into two armed camps. There was a multiplicity of reasons for why the continent descended into the First World War over the next 5 weeks, but it possibly could have been averted had the Habsburg government not insisted on intervening in Serbia to investigate the assassination in a way which would have fatally compromised Serbia's independence. Russia stepped in to defend Serbia, and things escalated from there until Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire ended up at war with Russia, France, and Britain. The degree to which Franz Joseph was responsible for the war breaking out is debatable. He was an elderly man of 83 years and worn out from a series of family tragedies over the years. He would never live to see the empire he had ruled for longer than any other member of his family collapse, as he died on the 21st of November 1916. By then, he had seen how mixed the performance of the Austro-Hungarian armed forces was. They succeeded in the Balkans, where they, the Ottomans and the Bulgarians, simply overpowered the Serbs. Even so, the broadly poor Russian army managed to launch effective counterattacks. When Italy entered the war in 1915, a vicious form of Alpine trench warfare developed on that front with Austria. Here, the Habsburg government was eventually forced to request German aid in 1917 as their forces faltered. Franz Joseph was succeeded in late 1916 by his great-nephew Karl I. He would ultimately be the last Habsburg to wield power. By 1917, the Austro-Hungarian army was only managing to cope because it faced such weak opposition. The Habsburgs' main ally, Germany, was taking the brunt of the assault by the Entente powers on the Western Front in France. Even so, the unity of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was breaking down, as ethno-nationalist tensions that had been simmering for over a century began to boil over as the war dragged on. This was especially the case from April 1917, after the United States entered the war on the side of Britain and France. To try and bolster the war cause and galvanize support for his family's rule, Karl spent much of 1917 and 1918 proposing new arrangements for the empire, notably the idea of establishing a triple monarchy, whereby the Croats would also be given a share of power in the empire in the same way the Hungarians had been back in 1867. He was unable to convince the different groups involved. Then near-famine conditions set in across parts of the empire by late 1917, followed by the arrival of the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918. The end came suddenly. In mid-October 1918, as the war entered its final weeks, revolutions broke out across the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and within days, Hungary and Czechoslovakia began breaking away to form their own countries. Many of the southern lands would eventually join what became Yugoslavia, while parts of the eastern territories were soon united with a newly reconstituted Poland after the war. By the time the armistice brought the war to an end on the 11th of November 1918, Karl was effectively left as ruler of nothing but Austria, and as ruler of this in name only. A day later, a short-lived German-Austrian Republic was proclaimed, effectively bringing Habsburg rule over Austria to an end after 636 years and nearly 900 years after the family had first established itself in northern Switzerland. In April 1919, the nascent Austrian Republic passed a piece of legislation which ordered the Habsburgs to leave Austria and not to return until they had formally renounced any claims to rule the country or the other territories they had held sway over for centuries. There were good reasons for this. Karl I had not given up on the idea of resuming control over a part of the Habsburg Empire. In exile in Switzerland in the years following the war, he made 2 attempts to seize power in Hungary through a coup d'état. These failed, and eventually he was forcibly removed from Central Europe and transported to the Portuguese island of Madeira, where he died young in 1922 after developing severe pneumonia. The Habsburg claim to rule over Austria and other territories consequently passed to Karl's young son, Otto. From abroad, he offered vocal opposition to the Nazi takeover of Austria in 1938. By then he was living in France and fled to Portugal and then the United States as the Second World War began. The Nazis had sentenced him to death in absentia for his opposition to them. After the war, he formally renounced the Habsburg claim to rule Austria in 1961 and was allowed to return to his ancestral homeland in 1966, 48 years after the flight of the Habsburgs. He then moved to Germany and became a member of the European Parliament. In this capacity, he played a significant role in the expansion of the EEC and the European Union as the Cold War came to an end. Otto formally renounced his position as head of the House of Habsburg in 2007, 4 years before his death. His son, Karl von Habsburg, grandson of the last Habsburg emperor, is the current head of the House of Habsburg. He served as an MEP for Austria between 1996 and 1999 and has worked with various international organizations. The story of the House of Habsburg is nothing short of incredible. There is almost nothing else like it in the history of the world. Every major dynasty that comes to rule over vast territories usually does so at the end of a sword or a gun, or a combination of military coercion and commercial and naval power. This is true of Rome, the Mongols, the British and the United States, and also of dynasties like the Hohenzollerns of Prussia, the Romanovs of Russia, the Ming in China, or the Mughal Empire in India. The Habsburgs were different. They started out as a minor noble house from Western Germany, who built Habsburg Castle in northern Switzerland in the 11th century. From there, shrewd diplomacy saw them rise to acquire greater amounts of land in Germany, Switzerland, and then Austria. In 1452, Frederick III became the Holy Roman Emperor. This was just at the beginning of a century in which the Habsburgs rose to global preeminence without doing much beyond marrying into other families. In 1477, they acquired the Burgundian inheritance through marriage. Then, the marriage of Joanna of Castile to Philip the Handsome brought them the Spanish crown, just as Spain was finally uniting and its conquistadors were beginning the conquest of vast parts of the Americas. The death of Louis II in battle in 1526 delivered 3 crowns. those of Hungary, Bohemia, and Croatia, into the hands of the Habsburgs, again because of earlier marriages. Every setback over the next 2 centuries seemed to be compensated for by some further gain. As they lost Silesia to Prussia in the 18th century, the collapse of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the weakening of the Ottoman Empire brought new territories as compensation in Eastern Europe and the Balkans. The Austrians lost war after war against the French from 1792 onwards, and yet managed to exit the Napoleonic Wars in an even stronger position in Italy. Yet their luck eventually ran out. In the 1860s, the Austrians were no match for the brilliance of Otto von Bismarck as a statesman in managing to finally unite Germany under Prussian rule, while ultimately the multi-ethnic nature of the Austro-Hungarian Empire could not be contained. It was both the primary spark for the beginning of the First World War and the thing which led to the collapse of Habsburg rule in 1918 as the war ended in the defeat of the Central Powers. It was a remarkable story for a family that started out in a humble castle in northern Switzerland nearly 900 years earlier. What do you think of the House of Habsburg? Were they a family that rose to immense power through sheer luck based on their marriage alliances, or were they a dynasty of gifted individuals who managed to influence European history for roughly 900 years? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.